Smartphones are getting more expensive year after year. Samsung's asking over $900 for its Note 8 device, and Apple's asking over $1,000 just to get your hands on the iPhone X. And while most of these flagships are asking more and more from your wallet, there are a couple of manufacturers who are trying to swoop in and fill that budget gap. Doogee is one of these companies. Now, you've probably never heard of Doogee, but that makes sense. They're not exactly the type of company who wants to spend a ton of money on marketing. Their new Mix phone may not have the best cameras or prettiest screen on the market, but it does have a lot of the fundamentals that make a pretty good smartphone. And for $200, that's really all we could ask for. This is the Mix by Doogee. Now, you've probably already noticed, but the Doogee Mix isn't exactly original. It's really anything but. If you took a Xiaomi Mi Mix and you shrunk it down to about 3/4 of the size, this is probably what you would get. It's got that same candy bar style all-metal design with a lot of screen in the front, and it even shoves the front-facing camera into the bottom right, just like Xiaomi. That isn't to say that the Doogee Mix doesn't have its own set of features though. It's got a fingerprint reader in the front and even adds dual cameras in the back to compete with the other top dogs on the market. Now, these aren't exactly the best components that I've ever used, but honestly, they work pretty well, and for $200, what more could you really ask for? There's dual speakers in the bottom of the device, which are good enough for what they are, and there's even a headphone jack peeking out from the top. Talk about premium. In terms of value, you're actually getting quite a bit. There's 4 to 6 gigs of RAM and 64 to 128 gigabytes of storage, depending on the model you get, and the octa-core Helios processor actually competes pretty well against Qualcomm's own Snapdragon 835. Doogee even included one of those ring holders, which are oh so popular in Asian markets, though their packaging could have been a little less risque. Usability-wise, this phone holds its own pretty well. It's running a custom OS called Doogee OS, which is based on Android Nougat, and the tweaks they made are actually pretty useful. Doogee's got a custom theme store which lets you quickly tweak the style of your phone, and it changes everything from the wallpaper to the icon borders. If you swipe to the left from the home screen, you'll also get a custom curated newsfeed with 5 different categories. And while I enjoyed it, you can take that as you will. Besides these tweaks, this is pretty much stock Android. You get all the settings that you get in a regular Nougat device, and I've actually already received 4 security updates in the last week or so I've spent with it. Now, this wouldn't be a $200 phone if it didn't have some trade-offs. First of all, the company is using micro USB to power this thing. And while this doesn't really disrupt the usability of the device, I would have liked to see USB Type-C in order to keep it more up to date. It also uses the USB 2.0 standard, so if you're trying to use a wired connection to transfer data over this thing, you're gonna have to wait a while. The cameras are also very so-so. There's a 16 and 8 megapixel shooter on the back, and while I appreciate the 1 and 2x optical zoom, the photos that came out were pretty grainy and muddy. These dual cameras can pull some fancy tricks like the emulated depth of field that are popular in a lot of flagships these days, though it does it a lot worse than something like the Galaxy Note 8. That being said, Doogee did include some fun filters and even a pro mode in this phone, which allows you to tweak individual settings like ISO and aperture. The photos also look a lot worse on the phone than they do after you transfer them to a better screen, so don't judge them immediately after you take them. This brings us to the biggest feature and compromise of this phone, which is the display. It's clearly copying the Mi Mix in terms of form, but its resolution is the thing that took the biggest hit. This is a 720p screen, and while you think that might ruin the phone completely, I would actually disagree. Sure, you're not going to be doing VR on this thing, but for a 720p screen, it actually looks pretty good. It's made by Samsung and uses AMOLED technology, so you're still going to get darker blacks than you would on any LCD panel. For most of the tasks you're probably going to be using this phone for, you likely won't be disappointed, though things like Instagram or Snapchat are obviously going to take a hit. Okay, I hear you, you're a bit bummed out about the screen, but having less pixels to push actually pairs extremely well with the massive battery in this phone. The Doogee Mix is sporting 3,880 mAh of power, which is more than a lot of flagship phones can brag about these days. I got a solid day and a half using this thing as my primary device, though I was on Wi-Fi most of the time because it only has one band that supports 3G in the United States. If you're in the UK or some other places, this thing will pick up a lot more 4G frequencies, but my fellow US residents will probably want to look elsewhere. The Doogee Mix isn't the most premium phone on the market by a long shot. It's missing a lot of the extra bells and whistles that make these current day flagships worth the extra cash. What it does have, however, is a lot of the fundamentals that make a smartphone really fun to use on a daily basis. And for $200, I really couldn't ask for that much more. If you like this review, make sure you head over to the full article where I've broken this phone down in a lot more detail, and stay tuned to AndroidAuthority.com because, of course, we are your source for all things Android.